in ways that I feel like, sometimes we feel like we have to go back to the drawing board for now. So, there's a lot I draw from Du Bois, but I would just say briefly there are two key concepts. One is Du Bois's concept of the color line, and other is his concept of the new imperialism. So, Du Bois, the way that he writes about the color line, I mean, it shifts over time, but I feel like over the first few decades of the 20th century, he's really offering us a way to understand the evolution of how a new form of imperialism is coming into being, and how it's being legitimated through racism. So, there's a lot that I write about in the book about how he's using the color line, and how he's thinking, like, just like Frederick Douglass, quite expansively about how this works. So, he's not simply thinking about anti-Black racism. Du Bois is one of our fiercest and foremost anti-imperialists, but he's thinking about indigenous genocide in the U.S. He's thinking about U.S. aggression towards Mexico. He's thinking about anti-Asian racism. This is all formative to the way that he's thinking about how the color line is built and what sort of capitalist spaces it enables to come into being. So, in 1914, Du Bois writes a piece in The Crisis called, I think it's called Why Mexico, or it could just be called Mexico. And it's about the US invasion of Veracruz. And in this piece and in a piece he writes the following year called The African Roots of War, he's thinking a lot about this idea of the new imperialism. What's coming into being in the late 19th and early 20th century? And how do we think about the growth of US power within this kind of new modality of empire? So, to make a long story short, 'cause I don't know how much time we have, but uh, the the form of imperialism is one that's seemingly democratized. So, instead of, he says in an earlier period, like wealth production was, appeared to be the divine right of kings, right? You have a kind of bourgeois revolution being extended and legitimated by this idea that it enabled the kind of everyday man, the common man, to also benefit from it. And so Du Bois is very attendant to a kind of subjectivity that accompanies this idea, that, you know, any white man, anybody who identified as white, could share in the spoils of financiers of the period, whether or not they owned any assets, whether or not that was true. And what I talk about in the book is how it's in this exact period that, according to political economists like Giovanni Arrighi, this is also the ascendancy of U.S. hegemony. And so I think Du Bois gives us some language to both understand that there is a decisive new moment for the global capitalist system coming into being, around the same period that U.S. hegemony is ascending. So we have to understand these two things as a specific moment in time that I think really marks the kind of struggles against global capital in this period.
Yeah, I was thinking about some of Du Bois's writings on imperialism, and well, obviously, I mean, at least for me, anytime you think about imperialism, I also think about Lenin, and I think about the highest stage of capitalism, and the way that some of their analysis kind of really does dovetail with each other in talking about this new globalized capital or finance capital in particular. So can you just talk a little bit? I mean, I know I'm like jumping around, but there's a couple of really big figures that are very popular that make an appearance here that I think we should at least mention. Tell us a little bit about the cameo that we have from our Italian friend Gramsci, and what we talk about with regard to Gramsci, and well, how Gramsci fits into this book.
Sure. Well, in the chapter, How to Make a University, that's about Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Um, there's a section I spend trying to think about Gramsci in relationship to Ricardo Flores Magón. And I don't think the two are too often put in dialogue with one another, except for maybe the coincidence of their confinement, around the same period. So Gramsci, of course, is in a fascist prison in Italy, and Flores Magón is in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. What I thought was really interesting was to juxtapose them as, both thinkers that are trying to understand how, an organic uh, uh, intellectuals of the working class can develop, what it means to think about that in a prison. But what I was most interested in was really thinking about how Gramsci's unfinished essay, some aspects of the Southern question, really resonated with some of Flores Magón's writings about how to build political alliances to confront the kind of struggle at hand. So for Gramsci, he was somebody from the South. He's from Sardinia, right? And he's very interested in struggles of the peasantry there. And as movements for fascism were growing, I think he was very interested in how uh, Southern landowners and Northern capitalists were making these very successful appeals to the Southern peasantry through nationalism, right? Uh, Gramsci was also deeply uh, embedded in struggles among Northern industrial workers in Turin. Um, and I think the Southern question is his effort to really think about how these struggles can be conjoined. So, for peasants in the South, this requires renouncing the kind of nationalism that weaves them into a proto-fascist agenda. But in the North, this also means disabusing people of the racism and chauvinistic beliefs that they hold towards Southern, peasants in the South. So, it's a complicated move because it's not simply, okay, capitalism screwing us all over, and so therefore we have to have unity. There's a way in which he's attendant to like the regionally specific struggles, but he's carefully thinking through how you build alliances and how critical racism is as a fetter to preventing them. So, I moved from Gramsci to think through some of Magon's writings in both articles he wrote for Regeneracion, which was the newspaper that he and his comrades wrote, and also in some of his speeches and some of the letters that he writes from prison. Because I think, we forget to our peril how much people are thinking in painstaking ways about how you produce alliances across seemingly disparate spaces and struggles. And so, Gramsci, another incarcerated intellectual in this period, is thinking through very similar questions, you know, in face of fascism. So, these continue to be relevant questions.
When you mentioned his name already, so let's drop it one more time. When Marcus Rediker was on this show and we were talking about history from below and we were talking about what it means to make a history and historiography and so forth, we talked about, on the one hand, it is kind of, documenting the history of what's come before, but in a more real sense, it's really about informing our present and in thinking about our future. And that's one of the ways in which we understand history from below. And so I want to ask you, how does the history that you're making, to use the word that we've been talking about here, the history that you're making here, how is it intended to inform our present and our future?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a fan of Marx's line that we have to draw our poetry from the future, and also by his many cautions about um, drawing on, nostalgic, farcical imitations of past revolutionary struggles. So, the book is called Arise! Exclamation mark, um, because it takes as its title the first lyric of the Internationale. And as I say in the conclusion, there's a really interesting history of other authors who have gone to the International and plumbed its lyrics in order to try to make sense of the struggle before them. Melvin Dubofsky writes "We Shall Be All," which is a history of the anarcho-syndicalist industrial workers of the world. Frantz Fanon famously takes the second lyric, "Wretched of the Earth," to think about anti-colonial struggles in Algeria and beyond. And I was really moved by Dorothy Healy, who's another figure that I write about in the book. I went through her complete oral history at Cal State Long Beach, which Maurice Isherman conducted. And she says, shortly after she left the Communist Party, that she said, if I ever had a memoir, I'd want to title it "Tradition's Chains Have Bound Us." So a slight adaptation from the line, "No more traditions, chains have bound us." Because she says, in essence, in order for revolutionary traditions to remain revolutionary, they have to be, constantly questioning, constantly, relentlessly interrogating themselves. Otherwise they're not revolutionary anymore. So, a lot of this at present is trying to, like keep alive that questioning nature for the present. In a way that I hope keeps some of these traditions alive and open.
Absolutely. And I also think that, if I can read into the book a little bit, I think it also is speaking directly to activists in a very direct way. And in trying to, in a sense, remind us of the interconnected sort of nature of the political actions that we carry out. Because the nature of our media landscape, the nature of social media, the nature of cultural production today, everything feels very interconnected and yet totally disparate and atomized. And, everyone is in their own little world and not connected to each other, despite what technology pretends it does for us. And so, in a sense, I was thinking as I was reading through the book about, you know, that this is a book for historians, for students, for people who want to learn about history, but it's also a book for activists, for revolutionaries.
Absolutely, absolutely. I speak to a lot of classes, and people ask, sort of, what's my advice for writers now? And it's my advice for all humans now. Like, we all have to fight like hell. We all have to organize like hell to survive this moment, and to, hopefully build something better out of it. There are extraordinary forces arrayed against us. Uh, you know, I we can't, we can't think with, you know anything less than total urgency about the kind of climate catastrophe that's upon us. But we also have to, return to a lot of these questions that figures were asking, in the period of the advent of fascism, to think about the growth of far right, proto-fascist and fascist, and ultranationalist forces that are uniting, that can make very similar appeals, commonsensical appeals, to give people easy outs to difficult questions. And my sense is we have to have a sense of the world as big as the forces that are arrayed against us. And I write with the conviction that we have in the past, that we're a product of ongoing struggles. The work is cut out before us, and we have to do it now.
Could not agree more. Christina Heatherton, thank you so much for chatting with us today. The book, we've been talking about it. This is an absolute must read. Arise, Global Radicalism in the Era of the Mexican Revolution. Get yourselves your copies, preferably from independent bookstores wherever you can. Christina Heatherton is the Elting Associate Professor of American Studies and Human Rights at Trinity College in Connecticut. The book, again, Arise, Global Radicalism in the Era of the Mexican Revolution. Get yourselves a copy. Christina, thanks for coming and chatting with us today.
Eric, it's been great talking with you. Thank you so much.
Listeners, thank you as always. Talk to you again next time.